Hi everyone, my name's Chris and welcome to the Our Creative Connection podcast. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome Joanna Grace to the show. Joanna is an internationally recognised sensory engagement and inclusion specialist working to contribute to a world where people are understood in spite of their differences. Jo is also a qualified teacher and has worked in specialist and mainstream education, working with students of all ages and abilities. Joanna set up the Sensory Projects in 2010 to share the knowledge and creativity required to turn inexpensive items into effective tools for inclusion. Joanna holds a degree in philosophy and a master's in special education. She is a prolific writer with 9 books published and closing in on 200 articles in print and online media. So welcome, Jo. It's really good to have you on the podcast. I wondered if perhaps you could start by just like introducing yourself. I've done a little pre-recorded kind of intro, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
So I'm Jo Grace. I run the Sensory Projects. And I'm also a doctoral researcher studying identity and belonging for people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities.
And I know you document your PhD studies, don't you? I've been sort of following your adventures in the world of academia. How's all that going?
Most of my life is online, so I do a lot of social media for my sins, and yeah, my PhD process is a part of that, but I also have lots of little YouTube clips to do with autism and neurodivergence, and my Facebook photo albums are resource banks. So like I have a Facebook photo album that's all about inclusive children's literature, and I have one about how to make a weighted blanket. So yeah, my social media's got there's a lot out there.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the things that I really love about your work is that you aren't just showing people a sort of finished article or like you kind of, a lot of it is kind of like, here's where I'm at, here's what I'm doing, here's something you could do, here's my thoughts. Do you know what I mean? Like it feels like you're sort of bringing people with you on an ever developing sort of journey. Is that
I'm really
intentional?
glad you think that. Yeah, I think sometimes inclusion is presented as a destination that's been achieved.
Yeah.
Or as a goal, and if you do X, Y, and Z, then you've done it, finished. And I prefer to think of it as a direction of travel. So that's really encouraging that you think that my social media comes across as a direction of travel, because it would be like when you stopped. If you stopped, there's always more, isn't there? There's always more we can learn, and there's always more we can do, and it's enjoying the journey.
Do you think that's often the challenge with some of this stuff? Is that there's a perception that there's a sort of promised land that you're arriving at where everything is done, nothing ever needs to be kind of thought about again?
I think often these conversations come up in very real life situations, and so an organisation needs to demonstrate that they have been inclusive or they have adapted, and their fears around that come from political requirements upon them, the pressures of the families of the people that they're making these adaptations for. That there's a lot of stuff that people are frightened of, and when people are frightened they crave certainty, and so a rule like this is how you do it and it's done is a very reassuring prospect. And so I think people go for those rather than, and also there'd be a huge vulnerability in an organisation saying, well, we've done this, but we might not have got it quite right, and I wonder what we should do next. That's not general messaging that you get from an organisation. Although, as I say that, I've just come back from Parallel Windsor, which is a mass participation sporting event, and I'm one of the ambassadors for Parallel, and they are really good at that. They're like, we are being as inclusive as we can possibly be, and then in their next breath it's like, and how can we do better?
Yeah.
And you see that progression each year as I attend, like it's got a bit better, and you can still spot how we could change, and we just carry on moving forwards in that way.
Yeah, I love that. There's a lot of sort of organisational bravery required to kind of acknowledge that maybe there's sort of, we didn't get everything right, or maybe you can never get everything right. It's always in a state of trying to do better, trying to do more. I mean, how did this sort of story unfold for you? Like, how did you first sort of embark on this journey?
How far back do you want?
You decide. You
So
choose.
the story probably predates me, because my mum and my grandma both worked towards a more inclusive society in their own ways. And my parents met when they were at university, and they each had, you know, as like 18-year-olds, they each had a dream of something they wanted to do in their lives. And my dad wanted to build a boat and go sailing around the world. And my mum wanted to convert a double-decker bus so that it could take wheelchairs and people on flatbeds and things like this,
Yeah.
and take them on holiday to Italy. Which she hadn't watched too much Cliff Richard. She'd had this extraordinary experience. And they built the boat. They built the boat when they were at university. They built it by hand. They designed it on beer mats at the pub, and they had me in set sail. And so my early years were at sea. So they did my dad's dream, and I think I'm my mum's bus. It's like I'm what became of that dream, because all through my growing up she continued to, like, she would work at the local special school summer play scheme, and she did respite foster care for people, and she worked for the family fund and the independent living fund. And so, like, my summer holidays from school were spent playing with the kids from the local special school.
Yeah.
And so neurodivergent and disabled people have just always been a part of my normal. And then that's reflected in my adult life, where I'm a qualified teacher, but I taught at a school for children with severe and complex special educational needs and disabilities, and then it just sort of one thing leads to the next, and the whole progression of it has just been doing more of the stuff I'm good at and less of the stuff I'm bad at, because I was a sort of mediocre teacher, but I was really good at creative practice and finding ways to connect with students that maybe other people couldn't always connect with, and then that's how you sort of go into the sensory projects.
So were there things that you were noticing that weren't connecting with the students and the young people, or that were that you found jarring? What sorts of things were you noticing?
Well, so it wasn't so much not connecting. It wasn't other people's failures, it was mine. So our school were looking at the inclusion of people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, and they recognised that, you know, like if you have Down syndrome, if you have autism, somebody will make a decision about where it's best for you to go to school. But if you have a profound multiple learning disability, the decision is made from the start. It is assumed you will go to the special school.
Yeah.
And then quite often you'll be put in a special class in the special school. So you've experienced this double segregation, which has been questioned by researchers like Ben Simmons, and there's other work that looks at that from other countries. Basically, it's worth questioning it. But we in the school, we were questioning that, and so we were looking at how we could better include the people with profound multiple learning disabilities that went to our school. And so once a week on a Wednesday, the plan was that they would attend their peer age class. So instead of being in the special care class, they would come out and attend one of the peer age classes. And I was the class teacher in one of the peer age classes. So once a week on a Wednesday, I would have my own class, and then I would have these two people in funky wheelchairs with all sorts of tubes and bleeps and a member of staff to, you know, press the buttons when needed, would arrive. And I was very on board with the plan of these people being better included. But it's one thing to have the good intentions and another thing to know how to do it. And so they would arrive on a Wednesday, and I would spend all of my weekends, all of my evenings, all of my holidays thinking, what will I do on Wednesday? What will I do on Wednesday? And they'd arrive on a Wednesday, and I would try and do something, and it would work for my class because they were the students that I was better able to provide for at the time. And the two people in the funky wheelchairs would just sort of be parked there. And the parking of people with profound disabilities is something that you see reflected across the literature. You know, it's nice that I was happy that they were there, but if there is just like you're sat in a room and somebody doesn't mind you being there, it didn't really feel very inclusive.
Yeah.
So I would go away and I'd go, what will I do on Wednesday? What will I do on Wednesday? And I'd come back with a session that was pitched entirely to them, and I'd lose control of my class. My class would be climbing the walls. Actually, what would actually happen is there was one chap in my class at the time who, if he was disengaged, communicated it through nudity. So he would just strip and run away.
Wow.
Like, I've had enough of this business. It's like, you know, like when you get in from a work day and you take off your work clothes. It's like that, but much faster.
Okay.
And he was somebody who, so we would lose him, and like, he was somebody who wasn't a great fan of people, but he really liked cars. And there was a big main road up behind the school. So when you lost him, he would run to the road to play with the cars. And, you know, there are certain skills required as a teacher. Top one is you shouldn't lose children. Second to that, you definitely shouldn't lose naked children. Third, not naked disabled children, and definitely not naked disabled children in traffic. You know, like, by the time you're doing that, you're hitting the national. You'll be on Fox News, won't you? So we used to try and not have that happen. But like I said at the start, I'm good at creative practice, and I'm good at connecting with people who may be neurodivergent people, basically. But I am rubbish at working as part of a team. So I never mentioned to anybody that I was struggling with Wednesdays. I just worried about Wednesdays. And eventually the teacher in the room next door to me came across, and she said, presumably because of the number of times she'd seen the streaker, she must have figured it out. She said, "Jo, have you ever tried a sensory story?" And she gave me one of these boxed pre-resourced sensory stories. And it was like this Damaskian hallelujah, da-da, here is the solution. Because in that story, I had something that I could meaningfully do with the whole class, and everybody could be included, and it was fantastic. But one of the people that came to visit me was deaf-blind, and the story didn't have any tastes or smells in it, because it's difficult in a pre-resource story to have those things preserved over time. So for her, it was just a box of things to touch, and I would read it with her and think, well, this isn't like as good as it could be. And then the story itself was quite odd, and it was like, once upon a time a girl rang a bell, and then she got out, and you're like, why did she do these things? And I've since had this horrible moment where I was saying exactly that in front of a hall of, you know, a couple of hundred people, and then we stopped for a tea break, and a lady got out of the audience and she walked towards me and she said, "I wrote that story." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." She said, no, it's fine. She said, "We wrote it for a particular person, and it describes their morning routine." And she said, "It probably doesn't make sense to anybody else." And I said, no, it really didn't. And then I had, on my performance management at that time, so, you know, I discovered sensory stories. My entire curriculum, not just Wednesdays, every day of the week was taught through sensory stories. History, geography, PE, all of it, because there's so much benefit. There's such a hidden gem. And then we had this staff meeting, and I had on my performance management target for the year a target that was to speak more to other members of staff, because I wasn't great, but I was so shy, and so like they put it on my performance management that I wasn't talking to other people. That's how serious it had got. They'd be very pleased with me now. I talk to lots of other people now. And I had it on my performance management 2 years running, because I was considered to have failed it the first year. And I tried so hard the first year. Like, I even went to the staff Christmas do, you know, and that's hardcore. But I failed. So I had this target, which was to speak more to other members of staff. And we had a whole school staff meeting, so that's a lot of other staff to talk to, about what to spend our literacy budget on for the year. And our literacy budget for the year, to provide for just shy of 100 students that we had at the time, was £200. And so you'd think it's not like an important thing because it's just £200, but we only had £200 to buy something that would be useful to all of these students. And so they had this whole school meeting, and they said, "What do you think? What should we buy? You know, we want your ideas, what's been useful in your class." And I sat there thinking, well, sensory stories. It's clearly the answer, isn't it? We should buy sensory stories. And well, I know the answer to the question, and they keep asking the question. So I put my hand up, and then they stopped. Everybody stopped, and you go, "I think we should buy sensory stories," and everybody agreed with me. And I don't know if they agreed with me because it was a good idea, or just because they're all lovely people trying to encourage me to talk more. But for our £200, we were able to buy 5, and And I remembered then realising that the stories that were so beneficial to the students in my class were not stories that their families could afford to buy at home. And it would be really neat if I said, so then I set up the Sensory Story Project, but actually the distance between those two things is about 11 years. Because there's a phenomena, and I don't know if some of your listeners will have come across this, but certainly if you work with disabled children, I don't think so much if you work with adults, but when people find out that you do that, the response is, oh, how rewarding. And I was desperately trying to provide and do my best by these children, and yes, there were rewarding aspects to the job, but mostly I was knackered and stressed and frightened. And I've got a group of friends who are all the boys that I studied further maths with at A level. So there's only a niche group of people that do 2 maths A levels, and most of them are male. And we meet up at Christmas or, in the summer when everybody comes home to see their families. And there's always somebody new around the table, and you go around going, and the boys now all do proper jobs, like they calculate something for, it's all jobs I wouldn't understand. And so you go around the table introducing yourselves, and they get to me, and you go, I'm Joe, and I work with children with special needs, and everybody goes, oh, how rewarding, oh, you must be such a lovely person. Like, no, I'm really not. So I used to just distract them by going, yeah, it's very rewarding. We do this thing called sensory stories. And like, does your work have a particular smell? Is there a particular sound that I would, like if I was writing and you get into interesting conversations with people about, smells and textures and tastes that they've experienced at work or in their lives. And it was just a really good distraction technique. And then one of them, when Kickstarter launched in the UK, called me on it. He said, Joe, you should kickstart for that thing you've always gone on about. Like, I didn't ever intend to do anything about it. It's like the ones you say don't have enough experiences in, that like aren't affordable for the price of a typical kids book and need to be really interesting stories. That would be a Kickstarter campaign. And so the original Sensory Story Project was a Kickstarter campaign to write 5 sensory stories.
And is that how it came about then? It was sort of someone else who said,
what
about this? What about this online fundraising thing? Because it's not easy to get Kickstarter funding at all, is it? It's not.
16% of Kickstarters got funded when I ran my campaign. You have to pick an amount of time to run for, and you have to meet your funding goal by that deadline. So I picked 42 days, which will be a reference to some people, and I worked 15-hour days for 42 days straight. And I only, obviously I worked all of that hoping, but I didn't. I only 16% believed that it might happen. And
I love that you picked 42 days.
Yeah, of course. You got to pick an amount of time.
I love it, yeah. The meaning of life and everything. So tell us about that whole process then. How did you go about sort of promoting, presenting, getting people on board with this idea?
Well, so this friend said, you should do this, you can do this. And I didn't. I mean, I agreed with the should part, but I didn't think it was I was still the person who didn't speak to other people then. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to make a video. And we filmed this video. My partner and I at the time filmed this video of me explaining what sensory stories are. And he kept saying to me, stop looking like you're being shot. And I was like, you are actually shooting me though, you're shooting video.
Yeah, that's not helping.
If you dig out the old Kickstarter campaign, there's a sort of frightened me against our living room wall explaining that some things feel a bit interesting. And then it took us 2 days to shoot 7 minutes. And it's still considered quite a long one, but we couldn't work out how to edit it down shorter. And then we showed some friends to see if they got the gist that we were hoping to convey in this 7 minutes. And they did, but they said I had too much cleavage showing. I was like, I'm not refilming it with a vest on. It's like, I'm done. So there's fractionally too much cleavage in the original one, according to our feedback group. And then I launched it, and then you realise, well, how will anybody know it's there? How do I tell people? So I set up a Twitter account. But you should do these things before. Like if you're taking tips on how to run a Kickstarter, build your following before you launch. And I started talking about it online. I emailed all the people that I knew that, my parents backed it, my auntie backed it, my friends backed it. And the backstage of Kickstarter, you get this little graph that shows you your funding goal and the time of your campaign and how you're sort of going, towards it. And Kickstarter, for people who don't know, it's like a sponsorship thing, but it's also a bit like eBay, because in return for people's money you have to offer rewards. So like if you backed me for £5, I would send you a smell in the post. And I had all these different...
Was that the that's what the tiered sort of offers were?
Yeah, £5 was a smell in the post. And so the start of the graph is like all my friends and family and everybody else I know in the world that I can think of to email.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of stops and you think, I've got to, how do I find more people? And so I did all these things. I wrote blog posts for people. I got myself onto national radio twice, and I didn't get any backers from that.
Oh, really?
Like, how do you? Yeah, you basically hand inviting people, figuring out who would be the people, making the connections with people who would understand what I was talking about and understand the value of it. And at one point, I have a hero in the sensory engagement world. It's a lady called Flo Longhorn. She's retired now, and she's put up all of her old books and resources available for free on her website. So it's a fantastic little goldmine of resources there. But Kickstarter sends you an email every time somebody backs you, like, you've been backed by £5 by Jeff from Southampton, that sort of thing. And I got this email saying, Flo Longhorn has backed your project. And I just cried, and I got taken out to dinner by my boyfriend. I was like, I can't believe that's happened. And that was like a little notch up on my graph. Yeah. But we got so that everybody in the whole world that would ever possibly back it had backed it. And the graph it looked like it was going perfectly in a diagonal line towards the end point. But we got to about 2/3 through, and I do not know anybody else. Like, I have asked everybody, I've been on national radio, and you think, well, that's it. That's the end of it. And then this school phoned up and they said, we'd like to back your project for £1,000. And my reward system went up to £50, I think.
How much were you asking for in total for your...
£5,000.
Right. Oh, wow.
So yeah, £50 was the most I'd imagined anybody putting towards it. Maybe 100, but... They phoned me up and they said, what can we have? And you're like, well, my life? What do you want? Anything. They said, we want a boxed, resourced copy of every story that you produce. Yes. We want a set of all the rewards. Yes, of course. We want you to come and tell sensory stories to our students. And I'm somebody who doesn't speak in public. They're like, but yes, okay. And we'd like you to deliver staff training to tell our staff all about the sensory stories, because in my output for the Kickstarter I'd been explaining why the sensory stuff is so important, why the storytelling is so important, what sensory stories are. So there was all this information I'd been sharing, and they went, we want all of our staff to know all of that. And you go, yes. And then I had all these confused conversations with the school bursar going, I'm supposed to give you who are you? Like, are you a charity? Are you? I was like, no, I'm not. And it was worse, because mid-Kickstarter campaign, I actually moved countries. So I was in a different country. I was in Germany, and I'm supposed to send you, do you need it in Deutschmarks? Like, you need it in euros? But that school backed it and sent it way over the line. And I sent them all their boxed pre-resourced stories. And I did a staff training for them, which is the start of me being a trainer. And then the head teacher said, I'll let you know when we want you to come and tell the stories. And I was like, okay, I'm on standby. And then she phoned me up and she's like, I've got it. I know when it's going to be good. She said, when I was younger, I loved Glastonbury. And I always promised myself, if ever I got headship of a school, I'd take the students to Glastonbury. And she was head of a mixed ability special school. You're like, no, wow. Don't do, like, the toileting situation at Glastonbury is not accessible. And she said, and then I realised that there were certain accessibility issues. I was like, good, I'm glad you realised before you got there. She said, so I bring Glastonbury to school. And I live way out in rural Cornwall. You know, the little place that I live has got no road names and no house numbers. It just has very sad new delivery drivers who have to read every house one by one. And so when she said, I bring Glastonbury to school, I pictured the kind of village fete that I encounter, you know, like a table with some cakes, and then another table with a sheet of squared paper where you guess where the treasure is hidden, and the men from the pub with a plastic tube and a bit of fur fabric and a cricket bat for Bat the Rat, which is such a strange thing. And I got there, and she was, I think she was in Manchester, but she was in a big city somewhere. And it was like she'd carved a wedge out. Like she'd got stages, she'd got the main stage, she'd got people everywhere. She didn't have people selling drugs, but people would come up to you and go, do you want cake? So people were peddling cake. There were flag twirlers and stilt walkers and just this whole circus. And the sensory story that I'd taken with me to tell is called The Birth of a Star. And it was written in conjunction with physicists. And it's just 7 sentences long. And it tells with scientific accuracy how stars are formed in stellar nurseries. And it was one of the original stories on the project, and it remains one of my favourites to tell. But what it is a small box with some torn up bits of paper or confetti in it, a bit of elastic, a tin with a rock in it, stone, like a pebble in it, or a penny, something like that. This twizzly ribbon thing on a stick, and one of those clicky heat pad hand warmers, and some bits of coloured cellophane. So you sort of turn, it looks like a handful of recycling. Like, it doesn't look like anything. And so I arrived at this amazing thing that looks like, and I'm just there with my little bit of elastic and some cellophane, and she's like, we've reserved the sensory room for you. I was like, I don't need the sensory room. Because this is like the wonderful thing about sensory stories. Like, if you have sensory rooms, fantastic, they're amazing spaces, but actually a bit of shredded paper and a bit of elastic and some coloured cellophane, you can do magic with those things. But anyway, she put me in the sensory room, which is good, because when the star is born, it's a torchlight through blue cellophane, and that shows up better in the dark, and you can create a nice amount of darkness in the sensory room. And then through the day, she brought me all the different people from that festival to be told the story to. And I had this amazing day of telling this story to all sorts of different children who attend the school, but I also told it to the goth rock band that played the main stage, who were like, yeah, we saw a Brian Cox documentary the other week, and I told it to, they'd got a special unit for autistic people who couldn't attend mainstream but didn't have intellectual disabilities, and these were all like young men, 16 to 19-year-olds, and they were running the tech for the entire day. So they'd all got like walkie-talkies on them and various, and they were like, yes Jeff, I'll check the lights on stage 6, and they were sort of busy, and they came in to check that the tech was working in the sensory room, because it was all dark because I wasn't using any of it. And I was like, yeah, it's fine, I'm just telling the sensory story. About, oh well, what's that? And so I told them the sensory story, and then they were telling me like what they know about black holes, and like it started a conversation. I told it to 2 mums who were looking for somewhere to change their babies' nappies, and I told it to the babies as well. And the babies are like dangling off the bungee cord and looking at the torchlight, and the mums are going, oh, I didn't know that's how stars were made. And then the highlight of the day was they brought me the people who attended that setting who have profound multiple learning disabilities, and they brought them to me in pairs. So I would have 2 people who I've never met before come into a dark room, and I'd tell the sensory story to them. And sometimes storytelling is thought of as just an output thing, like you're on broadcast. But it's a 2-way process, because you respond to people as they respond to you. And so typically in these pairs, you would get one person who responded more than the other. And so you end up kind of talking, you're not talking because you're just telling the story, but you end up more orientated towards them than the other one. And in one pair, one chap just looked like he was asleep. I didn't know that he knew that there was a story happening at all, whereas the other chap was, you know, vocalising, reaching for things, turning, you know, smiling. And so I know, obviously I shared the bungee cord with both people, and I threw confetti over both people, but I know that I told the story to the responsive guy more than I told it to the guy who looked like he was asleep. But right at the end, when the star is born and this blue light is shone, because stars are blue when they're first born, the chap who looked like he was asleep lifted his head up a bit and smiled. And I thought, oh great, so he did know something was going on. And when he did that, the lady who'd brought him in, she got up from the back of the room, she came around the front of his wheelchair and she looked at him and she looked at me and she said, "We've never seen him do that before."
Wow.
And I hadn't done anything amazing because I told the story to the other chap.
Yeah.
But sometimes the simplicity of experiences like that. He was somebody who struggled to see, not because his eyes weren't working, but because his brain wasn't making sense of the information. And being asked to see in day-to-day life, when there's lots of information and lots of light coming from lots of different objects, and it might be the thing you're supposed to be, how would you figure it all out? It's far too confusing. But I'd put him in a dark space with no other stimulation. He wasn't, the way that I tell the stories, I share the sentence and then I share the experience. So he wasn't even being asked to look and listen at the same time. He was only being asked to look, and he was only being asked to see one little blue point of light and nothing else. And he could do that. He could understand that. And the joy is like, oh, I can see something kind of joy. And it's absolutely fantastic.
I love the accessibility of it, that you're using sort of materials that would be easy to carry around or easy to get hold of or easy to sort of share. And I love the idea that you like breaking it down into sort of, I'm only talking now, and then we're only showing, or we're only touching, or we're only going to do one thing at a time, and just really stripping out all the other.
The cheap stuff is because I wanted them to be affordable for the price of a tip book. So if you're buying resources, then you're going to be out of that bracket straight away. But if you can improvise resources from the contents of your recycling bin, then you're fine. And also it means that if people break them, you're less precious about it, because there's always more recycling. You can always get some more. But it's like a haiku art form. It's about the space and the pairing and back of things. More is not more, less is more, sort of thing. But it's because I'm very used to working with people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. So I know a lot of people who have capacity across all sensory systems, but not all at the same time. There's only so many things any of us can do at once. For me, if I want to send a text message as I'm walking down the street, I will stand still to do it, because that's my limit. But for some people, they're making choices between seeing or hearing, touching or listening. And if you're making those choices, you tend to always make them in the same direction, because you choose the thing you're best at. So if it's not this is the right way of doing it, because there are other people for whom it will get more interesting the more sensory systems you stimulate, and you want something that you're listening to and looking at and touching and smelling all at the same time. But often I find that for people with a profound intellectual disability, it's more accessible when it's monosensory rather than multisensory. And if you're somebody who has to make that choice between feeling something with your hands or seeing it or hearing it, so it's one of those things that you commonly see where somebody will be past something and they turn their head away and people go, no, look at what I'm showing you, and they're trying to feel that, because they turn their head away so that they're not distracted by the visual information, so that they can focus on the touch, because you've just given it to them to touch. But if you're somebody who has to choose between feeling, listening and looking, and I give you a multisensory experience that you can touch and you can hear and you can see every sentence of a story, you'll only choose that. People choose hearing. They default to hearing most commonly, because it's the sensory system that becomes active first in the womb. So I offer you a thing to touch and to look at and to listen to, and you hear it. And then I do the next sentence and I offer you a thing to touch and to listen to and to look at, and you hear it. And so across a seemingly very multisensory story, you actually have a monosensory experience. Whereas in my stories, I try always to be like, on this sentence, I'm asking you to smell. And on this sentence, I'm asking you to look. And although individually it looks quite, it's not as fancy and it doesn't look as impressive as something that lights up and shakes and changes colour and plays you a song whilst it's doing it. But actually over the course of a story, you might have had a multisensory experience because it was presented in a monosensory way. I'm just thinking about experiences that I've had working in with us in a sort of special educational setting, and what you said earlier about having sort of a couple of people who were sort of profound multiple learning disabilities kind of almost plonked in the room,
and stuff's happening around them.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience of sort of almost in the moment, trying to think of, okay, I'm doing a photography based project here, you know, like I'm holding up pictures, like, you know, how am I even going to even think about creating opportunities for people to kind of connect and engage with this. And actually, you know, ended up doing stuff with lights instead, because I was like, you know, this isn't really about a picture anymore. So I love breaking it down into its component parts and just saying, actually, maybe that's the building blocks. Is we're going to look at these things, we're going to take each one of these senses one at a time. Because you know, with my work in photography, you know, yeah, it's visual, but there's a multi-sensory thing going on, because we can listen to each other's voices, we can get hands-on with materials. It's inspired me to really reimagine some of the photo voice work that I do, to kind of just pick it apart and think about, how do you rebuild this in a way that would work for anyone, really, that you know, anyone could engage with it in a different way.
The other thing that commonly happens around people with profound and multiple learning disabilities is often they're people who don't use mouth words, so they're often people who don't talk, and it's an interesting one. So when I got the funding for the Kickstarter, I had this panic moment where I'd been talking about the stories for 11 years, you know, in pubs and finding like nice ideas for stories and things like this. But I didn't want it to be based on what I thought. You know, I didn't want it to be based on my bright ideas, because however bright I think my ideas are, and obviously I think my ideas are great. Who has ideas they don't think are great? I'm often wrong. Like, I know I'm a very fallible person, and so I sort of had this panic moment when I got the funding, and I used the money to take 6 months off work and read research. I wanted to know, like, okay, what do we know about how people perceive the world at a sensory level, and what do we know about people with profound disabilities? That's why I can say things like that phenomenon of people being parked is something that you see reflected, because in that first 6 months of running the sensory projects, I tried to read everything. It's not a possible thing, but I'm probably just the only person who's ever had that amount of time to just focus on that, and I carry on that research reading as I travel on trains all around the country now, talking to loads of people. It's very changed, but the what happens, and this is a thing from research, is when people don't produce language, the people around them, it's almost as if we have an allotted amount of language we're each supposed to produce, and somebody near them who cares about them will notice that they're not producing their allotted requirement, and so they up their production to cover them. It's like, don't worry, I'll do it for you. And so people end up talking more around people who don't talk than they would around people who do talk, and actually that can make the environment and the activities less accessible to those people. Certainly if you're somebody who's sat really close to a person, like if you're supporting somebody, you're often sat right next to them. When you talk and you're physically close to somebody, that has an even bigger effect on that cancelling out of experience. So it can be that if you're, you know, like you're handing somebody something to touch, like, oh, look at this interesting brush, isn't this fun? Oh, it's so fluffy and lovely, and oh, yeah, I see it. And all of this kind of verbiage, it's very friendly, can be cancelling out the sensation of feeling the brush. And so being able to be comfortable as people who use language to not use language, and it is an uncomfortable thing. We collect it, like, you know, if you go on a date and you go, there was an awkward silence, like silence is a feared thing once you're a language user. But if you imagine it as being, like if you went to a different country where you didn't speak the language, you just maybe had a few key phrases, and you were being welcomed in that country by a native speaker, would you want them to provide all the language they know and all the language they think you should know? Or would you want them to strip back their language so it was basically just the phrases you understood? Which one would feel more welcoming? And then we're looking to do the same as we approach people who don't use language. It feels friendly to us to use loads of language, but actually it can be more friendly to hold the silence and just be with people.
I love that analogy of speaking different languages or being comfortable with the silence. I mean, I find that so often, even when there aren't sort of communication challenges, that just the people's default is, oh, if I feel like we just dial up the intensity of the communication, I'll just give you more. I was in a meeting the other day where they were doing that, and I was just I feel like my brain's starting to go, and I was just like, is this intentional? Are you trying to sort of subliminally get something across here, or are you just, it's like white noise almost, you know, kind of you gets lost after a bit. So I really relate to that.
I'm no good at it. I know I am the white noise in the meeting. I do talk a lot now. I'm making up for decades of.
It's not sounding like white noise to me.
Thank you.
I mean, I think there's a confidence required, isn't there, to kind of sit with a silence long enough to invite the other person in. Yeah. And often the internal voice of the facilitator or the teacher or the trainer is like, oh, you know, our perception of like when it's quiet or when there's a delay or when there's a silence is like the default. Oh, my job is to fill that silence. It's useful for people to kind of think about the language side of it, and actually, like, yeah, that idea of like, if you only have a few words in a particular language, like, you don't want a native fluent speaker to overwhelm you. That's a really really useful sort of frame of reference, I think.
Yeah, and the less is more thing, because when you are the member of staff running the hour-long session, if you turned up and you said, okay, we're not going to do anything, we're just going to sit still and be quiet and maybe look at a torch, people are going to think, God, he must have had a hard weekend, he hasn't even bothered to plan something. You often find that people who are in those roles are playing more to the audience of adults. You know, they don't want to bore the adults, or they don't want to look bad in front, than they are to the audience of people that the session is for. So it takes a lot of bravery and confidence and conviction in its so like, and it's very easy for me to sit and talk about it, and I'm not somebody who can necessarily do it. I know, like, but I know people who do it. So there's a brilliant she used to be a special school teacher, she did a doctorate, and now she's a kind of independent researcher, bits of artsy things, stuff like this. She used to be a installation artist, Dr. Jill Goodwin. And she ran a session in a school with students with profound and multiple learning disabilities, where they gathered all the students together in a circle, and the staff sat in this circle. So you all sat round in this circle, quite close together. And she told the staff, right, that's it. We don't do anything. We don't say anything. We just sit here, and we will respond to them if they do something. And so all the staff just sit, and you wait, and the children think nothing's happening, so everybody goes, and it's already uncomfortable, and it's only like half a second silence there, wasn't it? and somebody will go, ah, and a member of staff will go, ah, and she ran this session over time. She ran this multiple times, and it got so that the young people recognised it. It's like, this is the time of the week where we're in charge. And it became like a chat between them that's only, doesn't need as much support from the staff. But when you're normally the last person to speak, or the least stable person, when do you get to lead, and when are you in charge? And so by stepping back, by not doing at all, there was a lot of enabling done there. The other really enabling thing, if you were looking for tips and tricks, is to allow processing time. Because I do training about how to share sensory stories and how to make sensory stories and things like this. And one of the common questions I get asked is, should I share them with the whole group all at once? Or do I do the sentence to this person and then the sentence to this person, or can you only do them one to one? And it's always a horses for courses, making the best of the situation you're in sort of answer. But one teacher said to me, she said, I was worried that the processing time of the students in the room was different, and that it wasn't meaningful for all of them to be in the story when we told it as a group. And she said, so I did an experiment, and it wasn't like a high research stuff, but it was a really good bit of practical action research. She got each student and put something in their hand, and then she timed with a stopwatch how long it took from the object being placed in their hand to them closing their fingers around it and beginning to explore it. And she said for most of her students it was a sort of a pause. You put it down in their hand, and then after it'd be like, the touch sensors are sending messages to the brain is going find out what it is and sending messages back to close the thing. So a pause, and then they would close their hands around it. And for one child it was 4 minutes of uninterrupted processing time before she shut her hand around something. And you think, if it takes you 4 minutes to register that you're touching something, and that's uninterrupted, what happens if you're interrupted? Like if you're touching, if I put that in your hand and you begin, it's a 2-minute journey up to your brain to go, there are touch signals here, but somebody's worried that you haven't noticed, so they go, it's a nice pink elephant, isn't it? So now you've got to switch, because now there's a sound and you're beginning the 2-minute journey on the sound, and then you still haven't done anything. So then they give it a wiggle, and so you come back and you just constantly beginning. When do you get to take part? And she said, I realised it wasn't meaningful for that child to be. She did a nice thing actually. She kept the child in the circle as they were telling the story as a group, because she recognised there was value to being a part of the group. But that child was just given the object from the first sentence to hold on to. And then when the story had finished and the rest of the group go away to do activities, that child would spend the entire session having the same story told to them at their pace of processing. And then that gives access. And then that story goes further, because I met somebody who works in a hospice with people at end of life, and she had a little girl that she was looking after there, and it was 28 minutes. And when do you get to take part in life if it's 28 minutes of uninterrupted processing time before you have access? So just shutting up and waiting, and then waiting a bit more, and just waiting and not saying anything is such a great revealer of capacity.
Wow. That's kind of mind-blowing, really, especially if you think in the context of like a lesson or a session. Might only be an hour, 90 minutes or less, 20
minutes.
And then and that's a tricky enough thing to navigate, even if you don't have that kind of delay on your, it's a multi-sensory kind of loud, noisy, fast-moving kind of environment sometimes in a school or in a college or wherever. So yeah, no wonder if you're getting constant sort of like almost a barrage of like sensory input.
It just all blends into one. It's it's a soup of experience, and you're not connected to any of it because it's all happening around you, and it doesn't matter.
Does that almost? Oh, sorry. Go on.
Because you have, you're got up in the morning, you're put on a bus, there's noises, there's fume smells, there's rain, there's stuff. You come into a building, there's noises, there's smells from the canteen, there's noise, and then the noises and the lights and the things now they happen to be a lesson, but why would you pay any more attention to them than you paid on the bus? It's just all part of the same soup. Nothing is connected to you, nothing is caused by you, so there's no link to you there. And people, you imagine it, like if the world just swirled around you, it would be very isolating, and you wouldn't call out into it, because it doesn't feel reassuring, and it doesn't feel like somebody's noticing you. It feels it's a bit spooky, really, isn't it? And if you're not feeling secure, then you're like, your senses at a primary level are about finding food and not becoming food. And when you're in a situation where you don't quite know, you don't shout out, because that might mean you become food for somebody else, don't you? You hunker down and you stay quiet. And you see a lot of passivity in people with profound intellectual and multiple disability, people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. And there's work that shows that some of that passivity is, like, obviously if you can't move your arm, you're not going to be flinging your arm around. But a lot of it is learned, and it's that response to not understanding and not being orientated and not being connected with, that means you just sort of go quiet and don't do.
And like you said, if when you do actually engage or show some expression, or that then increases the intensity of, however helpful and well-meaning, but actually it dials up when I do express myself. It's like, oh, flipping heck, like on a level, maybe you're just like, maybe I better just kind of like, keep quiet, stay low down, like not kind of. It's so fascinating that this journey that you've been on around, you know, going from your own practice in an education setting, and then finding sensory stories, and then that the Kickstarter journey, and then you mentioned about having this 6-month period of time where you were kind of reading and soaking up the academic side of things. You're currently studying? Are you in the final throes of studying your PhD? Can you tell us a little bit about your academic adventures?
So the sensory story project ended up just being the first of the sensory projects, and it spawned another one, which spawned another one, and another one, and another one. It got very out of hand, and as I've launched each new project, I've underpinned it with a literature review. You know, I've gone and read and found out, and as I travel around, I do about 18 hours on trains a week, I reckon, and I use that time for reading research papers. And obviously I would say to people, you should read the research, because it's really, I mean, it's not page turning stuff, but it's really useful to inform what you're doing. But most people don't have the time. Like, most people are not got 18 hours sat on trains, and I do try and read it at home, but I find I get a lot of laundry done and hoovering because they're not page turners. No offence to them, but on a train you already feel like you're achieving something because you're going somewhere, and so it's just a bonus. So I've kept up to date with the research as best I can, and to people watching me. So like my Twitter feed has, for a long time, it's currently not, but I will sort it out again. It has tweeted excerpts from the research that I read. So people who've known me online now have known me online for more than a decade, and they've seen me tweeting about research all the time. And so it would make perfect sense that I would go and be a researcher. Like, of all the people that you know online, of course it would be me. But in no way is that what it's like from my point of view. It's more like, it's like I've been a massive fan of a band. You know, like I've been to their every gig, I know all the lyrics, you know, I talk about them all the time. In no way, like, and then they go, oh, do you want to come up on stage and sing a number with us? No, in no way was I thinking I would be a part of this. But yeah, so I'm studying identity and belonging for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, and I am supervised by Mel Nind, who is one of the originators of intensive interaction, and Jo Hope, who is part of I think she led the MenCap Include Me project. So these two extraordinary women are my supervisors, and I get to meet with them every month and be guided by them, and they are so wise and so gentle and just superb. That's the part of the PhD that I will miss, is having, it's like having grown-ups in your life again. Like I've been an adult for a long time now, and I've got 2 children, and my parents are fine, but there's bits where you think, oh, I can see it coming, where I'm going to have to be like, we're the generation in charge, aren't we? And then suddenly I've got these 2 adults in my life who are just sort of steady and know what to do and can solve my problems for me, and it's wonderful. And they will go when the PhD finishes. I don't yet know whether I will finish the PhD or the PhD will finish me. It has been monstrously hard, and it's a quip, but it did nearly finish me off last year. But I can see the end. The end is in sight. I think I have a 3rd draft of a thesis now. So it might happen. I might be Dr. Joe. If I come back on the podcast another time, I could be Dr. Joe.
That's a deal. That feels like we have to do that now. That's yeah, absolutely. No, it's not a small thing that you know, but I know the process of doing it is challenging. But then, you know, the purpose and the meaning behind it is so important as well. You know, I think I first encountered you and your work through a mutual connection on LinkedIn, I think, and then as soon as I read like some of the stuff you were talking about, I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is kind of like you're framing stuff that I'd been sort of like thinking about, but then you've kind of like really delved into it. You've done the research. You know, I've got a couple of your books on my shelf. The stuff that I can't. Yeah, of course. Hang on. Sensory Stories.
That's the 2nd edition one as well.
Sensory Being.
Yeah.
You know, and so I love how you're bringing together this like world of sort of thought and academia and research, but then making it practical, making it real, always kind of centering it back. You know, it feels like you're in conversation with someone who's just come out of that classroom that you were describing at the beginning, who's like, yeah, you know, you're giving a practical context for something.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's, you know, just
Yeah,
sort
I'm
of
glad.
how you,
You never
yeah,
know when you write stuff how you come across to other people, so I like the way I come across to you. It sounds good. It's so good that you've got the second edition of the Sensory Stories book. When the original Kickstarter ran, because I had to do all the social media and get yourself on national radio and things like this, that publishing company found me and said, oh, we've seen what you're doing, would you write a book about it? And I had all the research reading that I'd done, so I put into that book all this is why we do this, like it's not just a piece of bungee cord, there's a really good reason for this. And the original book had 5 sensory stories. That second edition one has got 9, there's 4 guest authored stories, and the last story in that book is the high point of the sensory projects, because you would expect with any other art form, in time, the consumers to become the creators. But the idea around people with profound and multiple learning disabilities is that they can't. Like, they can't write stories. So that was never going to happen for them. They're the original consumers of sensory stories, but you would never expect to see them write them. And the final story in that book was co-authored by a group of 60 people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. And when I say co-authored, I don't mean between them and me. It was they created the story, and I wrote it down at the end, and so that story is, that's the best, absolute best. But the PhD work has been about, so the original, I have the enormous privilege of being a funded student, which is also the enormous pressure of being a funded student, because as a funded student my PhD is a job that I am doing. It's a 40-hour-a-week job. And bullet point number 1 on the job description is do a PhD, and then there are other bullet points on the job description that I also have to fulfill. But the original job description was to do a PhD with people with profound and multiple learning disabilities about identity and belonging. And obviously in that title, the profound and multiple learning disabilities, or profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, as you'll see me saying, because that's the more internationally recognised term, and identity and belonging, they're all the big words. Like, that's PMLD, identity, belonging. But I really noticed that word with. It's like, do it with. And I think the original with was probably they just meant that there would be people with profound and multiple learning disabilities that the work was happening with. But I understood it as, like, we will do this together.
yeah,
We will study identity and belonging together. And so you have to work out how. And there is a history of inclusive research, and it's a lovely history. So it's about 25 years old now, because research used to get done on people with disabilities, and not in a nice, like we do research on mice, horrible stuff. And that history is touching distance away, isn't it? There was a news story earlier this year about stuff that had happened in the 70s that was on people. We tested blood products on them. Then it was done for, and so it's not actually like it. So we'll do it if we can justify it, and it's in your interest. It's not that far from the original on, because we're like still testing stuff on you. It's just stuff you might need. And then the 4 gets a bit nicer, where we think a bit more about you and respect you more as people, and we do research that serves your interests. And then by, like, you've got inclusive research communities where people have worked out how to, like, enable somebody with Down syndrome to conduct interviews, go out. And there was a study done about the experiences of people who moved from the long stay hospitals into the community when we shut down the old institutions, and the researchers to find out what that experience was like. And the people who did the work were people with intellectual disabilities themselves, who had themselves lived in long stay institutions. And what the other researchers recognised was that they asked much better questions, because they understood that on Sunday nights, like, there wouldn't have been as many staff on duty, or so they knew all these little intricacies. And over time, we've worked out how to do inclusive research that includes and that is done by and with people with intellectual disabilities. And then we've checked whether this, like, is it just good because we're including them, or is there value in research terms to this? And there's a sort of seminal paper called The Added Value of Inclusive Research, where the value is recognised that you do get a better quality of research when people are included within it. But because it's become better and stronger and more recognised as valuable, the people who fund research have begun to say, we need research done about this topic, and it must be done inclusively. And so in order to say, okay, I'm going to do this research, you have to prove that you're going to be inclusive, which means that we need a list of what it means to be inclusive. We're back round to the start, aren't we? Yeah. We need some sort of certainty as to what it means to be inclusive. And so these lists of descriptions, you know, to be inclusive, the people with learning disabilities must have control of the research question. To be inclusive, the people with learning disabilities must be a part of the data analysis. They must be a part of, you know, you'll get a bullet point list of 7 points, 12 points, something like this, that defines inclusive research. This is what it means to be inclusive, and you can only get funded if you do these things. And those bullet point lists exclude people with profound intellectual disabilities. And so you have this sad sort of dip at the ending of this wonderful journey, where something that was pushing to be inclusive has ended up it's not done yet, the story's not over yet, but there is a risk of the most marginalised being further marginalised by something that's claiming to make things inclusive. And so my work has been about how to work out how to do research with people with profound intellectual, as in me and people with profound intellectual disabilities. We're going to do the research. How do we do it meaningfully together? And then obviously if you're going to do some research together, you need a topic. So I figured if we're doing it together, that checks the belonging box. So we will do research about identity. And so my PhD has been a group of 4 people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities doing research with me about identity. And it's been a fantastic adventure, but it's been really, really hard.
It sounds amazing. There are so many parallels with the way you framed the way that people can sort of, you know, receive or be supported or contribute to, you know, research. You know, I know well from sort of community development, asset-based community development sort of world, where the context is different, but at its essence, it's describing a kind of way that power works, a power dynamic. Yeah. You know, you can have things done to you or on you. Which would be that medical kind of situation, or things done for you, which would often be thought of as a sort of charitable kind of way of doing things, and then that with and by space, you know, just different sets of rules apply, don't they? And really interesting, again, a parallel, I think, where with good intent organisations seek to kind of show up in the sort of with and the by space, but that desire to have a checklist, or that desire to kind of control or measure or replicate or scale, or all the other words that get bandied around, has a tendency to actually negatively impact, especially those who were on the margins of it, those who were least involved. And so there's a real parallel there with the sort of community development side of things too.
You were right about the power stuff. If you're the organisation, you need to be in charge and in power. And to make it meaningful, you would have to surrender those things. Yeah. And in surrendering those things, you become vulnerable. And when I said about the work, you know, might finish me off, part of the reason for that is how genuinely I engaged with the surrendering of power. And you do make yourself vulnerable, and I was vulnerable. And then it's much, you know, life gets much scarier. So it's not just a simple thing. It's not just, you know, putting people on the posters who look a bit different. Yeah.
That's big ticket stuff. So, I mean, what's next for you, Joe, in terms of, you know, getting this PhD Dr. Joanna Grace has a great sound to it. What's next on your agenda once you've achieved that?
Recovery.
Yeah.
Genuinely, I keep promising myself after I do it, I will take time to recover. I would. Yeah, it sounds really impressive, doesn't it, Dr. Joe? But it's been a very humbling experience. I am such a massive fan of research. You know, I was a big fan of the band, and I have got up on stage and sung a song with them, and you'd maybe think that could launch your own music career, you know, that you'd once to sing a song with, you know, the big band. And so I think a lot of people who do get up on stage and sing a song then do use that to launch their own little music career. And what I've learned, I thought going into it that at the end of it I would have a choice between sort of continuing with the sensory projects as an independent or going further into academia. And, you know, there's a postdoc position being advertised at the moment by a researcher that I've read so much of their work, and it's fabulous work that they've done. And the postdoc position is to work with people with profound disabilities. They want somebody who can figure out how to do inclusive research at this level in a particular language. And I'm reading like, me, it's clearly me. And I know I can't do it, because one of the reasons that I'm so good at amassing big quantities of knowledge about very specific topics is that I'm an autistic person, and the social logistics of working in an institution like a university are very similar to the social logistics that I failed when I was a teacher that gets put on my performance management. You know, there are social skill hoops that I still can't jump, and I might not ever be able to jump, and I don't get a choice, because that part of the world is not accessible to me yet. And so I suppose it's having those personal experiences of inaccessibility that makes, like, I would like the world to be a more accessible and inclusive space, and it's not a totally charitable, it's like, for me too, please. So yeah, next is just recovery. I plan to hula hoop and watch bad television and like go outside sometimes. I don't think I've been outside for 3 years because I'm just tappy on the computer. I should talk to my children, should probably do a bit of that.
Well, I'm so grateful for you for sharing your experiences and part of your journey. As I say, for anyone listening, that you've got, is it 9 books that you've published so far?
Selling the original 5 sensory stories funded the writing of more, and there are currently 29 sensory stories published on projects. Since 2020 we started publishing stories by other authors. A further 15 stories have appeared in other books, but the books that you're talking about, the sort of book type books, yeah, I think it's something like 8 or 9. I'll probably write another book after the PhD, realistically.
I hope so.
But I have a lot of social media output, and my YouTube, I'm really putting some effort into that at the moment, so there's lots of free stuff to access. I'm trying to keep it short because people don't want to listen to you for a very long time, do they? So like little 10-minute films or 5-minute films that are about, so I've got a set of films that are about the PhD and the research journey there. I've got sets that are about autism and disability, and I'm plotting more. So the plan to recover is probably a daydream one, because realistically I'll just carry on working.
So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time, and yeah, take care.
Thanks for having me.